Is this really what you want?
We have nothing left to say.
The marble steps of the Franklin County Courthouse were the last place I ever thought I'd stand in my wedding ring, except I wasn't wearing it anymore. My hand was bare, and my husband's driver was gripping my elbow like I was a package he'd been paid to deliver, not a woman he used to call little sister over Sunday dinner. The paper in my hand said Dissolution of Marriage in bold black letters, and the man who filed it was standing 11 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the muscle jump in his jaw, far enough that it might as well have been a mile. Do-yun Choi did not look at me. 6 months earlier, that same man had knelt on our kitchen floor to fix a broken table leg because he didn't trust anyone else near the house. Now he couldn't look me in the eye long enough to say goodbye. If you've ever had someone choose silence over the truth, and you're still not sure if it was cruelty or the deepest kind of love, stay with me till the end, because I promise you, what I found out 6 weeks later changed everything I thought I knew about the man I married. Hit subscribe right now, because where I'm from, we don't let people walk away without a fight, and neither did I. 3 years before that morning on the courthouse steps, I was Sable Winslow, and my whole world was an 8-hour shift at a 24-hour diner off Route 9, refilling coffee for truckers and college kids nursing hangovers. I'd been a waitress since I was 19, and I was good at it, not because I loved carrying plates, but because I'd learned how to read a room the way some people read books. I could tell you which table was about to stiff us before they even asked for the check. I could tell you which man was about to cry in his eggs before the first tear fell. It was a survival skill I picked up from a childhood that taught me nobody was going to take care of me unless I learned to take care of myself first. Do-yun Choi walked into that diner at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in November in a suit that cost more than my rent, with 2 men trailing behind him who didn't order anything and didn't sit down. He sat alone in my section, ordered black coffee and dry toast, and didn't say another word for 40 minutes. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know that the quiet man in the corner booth controlled half the shipping routes on the East Coast, or that the 2 men by the door were there to make sure nobody looked at him too long. All I knew was that his coffee cup was always half empty, and every time I came to refill it, he watched my hands instead of my face, like he was cataloguing something. He came back the next night, and the next. By the 4th night, he finally spoke. "You remember every order at every table," he said, without writing anything down. I told him it wasn't a trick. It was just paying attention, something most people forgot how to do. He looked at me for a long moment, like I'd said something more important than I realized, and told me his name was Do-yun. He didn't tell me what he did for a living. He didn't need to. Money like that speaks for itself, and so does the silence that surrounds a certain kind of powerful man. It took him 6 months to ask me to dinner, and by then, half the diner staff had already placed bets on when he'd finally do it. It took him a year to ask me to marry him, on a rooftop overlooking the same stretch of highway where I used to catch the bus to work, holding a ring that could have paid off every loan I'd ever taken out in my life. I said yes before he finished the sentence, not because of the money. Because for the first time in my life, someone had watched me long enough to actually see me the girl who read rooms for a living, who'd learned to survive by making herself small and useful, and he made me feel like I didn't have to shrink for anybody, not even him. We married 4 months later in a courthouse, 2 blocks from the diner where he'd first ordered black coffee and dry toast, not because Do-yun couldn't have afforded a cathedral full of orchids and men who'd bow at the door, but because I asked for something small, and he never once tried to talk me out of what I actually wanted. Denise stood up for me in a borrowed dress. Grace, who I barely knew yet, cried quietly in the back row and told me afterward it was the first wedding she'd attended in that family, where the bride had chosen every single detail herself. I remember thinking, standing in that plain little courthouse room in a dress that cost a fraction of what Do-yun spent on watches, that I had never once felt smaller for wanting something simple. I didn't know yet that the very same building would one day hand me the opposite kind of paper, or that the word courthouse would eventually mean something entirely different to me than it did on that ordinary, sunlit afternoon. Marriage to Do-yun Choi came with a life I didn't recognize as my own, a penthouse with views that used to be postcards in my mind, a staff who called me Mrs. Choi before I'd even gotten used to signing that name, and a husband who, underneath the tailored suits and the men who bowed when he entered a room, still remembered to bring me dry toast on mornings when my stomach was in knots, because he'd learned my habits the same way he learned everything, by paying close, patient attention. For 2 years, it was good. Not perfect. I wasn't naive about what his world required of him. The late-night calls in rapid Korean, the men who came and went through our garage at odd hours, the way his eyes went flat and unreadable whenever business bled into our home. But he never brought that coldness to me, fierce with everyone else, careful with me. That was the deal we'd made without ever saying it out loud. The first crack came on a Thursday in March, disguised as nothing at all. A courier delivered a small, unmarked envelope to the penthouse, addressed to me, not to Do-yun. Inside was a single photograph me, from years ago, wearing my old diner uniform, taken through the window of a car I didn't recognize, dated 3 weeks before Do-yun and I ever met. No note, no name, just a photograph of a version of me that existed before I mattered to anyone, mailed to prove that someone had been watching me long before my husband ever noticed I existed. I showed it to Do-yun that night. I expected him to be confused or dismissive. Instead, I watched something shift behind his eyes, a stillness I'd never seen directed at me before, the same flat, terrifying calm he reserved for his enemies. He didn't explain. He just told me to stay inside the penthouse for a few days and doubled the men stationed at every entrance. I asked him who would do something like this. He said only, "Someone who wants to remind me I have something to lose." I didn't understand yet how much that sentence would cost me. 2 weeks later, my car was run off the shoulder of the highway by a black SUV that never slowed down, never stopped, never left a plate number anyone could trace. I walked away with a sprained wrist and a windshield full of spiderweb cracks, and Do-yun walked into the hospital waiting room with a stillness so absolute it frightened the nurses into silence. He didn't yell. He didn't ask if I was hurt more than once. He simply sat beside my bed all night, holding my uninjured hand so tightly I could feel his pulse hammering through his palm, and said nothing at all until dawn. "I should have told you the truth the moment that photograph arrived," he finally said, so quietly I almost missed it. Instead, I told myself silence was the same thing as protection. I was wrong, and it nearly cost me everything. After that, the penthouse changed. Guards doubled again, then tripled. My schedule, once mine to set, became something coordinated through 3 different men before I was allowed to leave the building. Do-yun started coming home later, leaving earlier, his phone permanently pressed to his ear in rapid, clipped Korean I couldn't follow no matter how hard I tried. When I asked him what was happening, he'd kiss my forehead and tell me it was handled, that I didn't need to carry this weight, that his job was to be the shield, not me. I didn't know yet that shields sometimes have to be sacrificed to save what's behind them. I started noticing him watching me differently, not with suspicion, but with something closer to grief, like a man saying goodbye to something before he'd actually lost it. I'd catch him standing in doorways just looking at me, memorizing the shape of an ordinary Tuesday morning like it might be the last one. I told myself I was imagining it. I was wrong. 3 days after the hospital, a man I'd never seen before sat down across from me at a cafe 2 blocks from the penthouse, ordered nothing, and set a small black lacquered box on the table between us before I'd even lowered my coffee cup. Inside was a single white paper crane, folded so precisely it looked machine-made, and beneath it, a torn strip of paper with 4 words written in careful handwriting. "Tell him we're patient." I didn't understand the message. I understood, instantly, the fear it was designed to produce. I called Do-yun before the man had even left his seat, my hands shaking too hard to properly hold the phone. And by the time Do-yun arrived 20 minutes later, the man and the box were both gone, as if neither had ever existed at all. Do-yun held that torn strip of paper for a long time without speaking, turning it over the way I would later turn over Priscilla's insults, looking for a shape underneath the words that made sense of them. "The silver crane," he finally said, "has wanted my shipping routes for 6 years. I always assumed they were patient enough to wait for an opening. I did not expect them to come looking for you instead of me." "Why me?" "Because they believe you're the only door into this house they haven't already tried to pick the lock on." He said it without looking at me, staring instead at the folded paper crane on the table between us, and something in his voice made my stomach drop in a way the actual threat somehow hadn't. "I will not let anyone use you as a door into anything, Sable." Not even if it costs us everything we've built. I didn't know yet that the sentence he meant as a promise would become the exact justification he used 3 weeks later to make the entire world believe he'd thrown me away. I didn't know that the paper crane folded so carefully on that cafe table had never actually come from the silver crane at all. That its precision matched exactly the kind of patience a man inside Do-yun's own house might use to make an old rival look guilty of a war neither side had actually declared. The divorce papers arrived on a Monday, delivered not by a lawyer's letter but by Do-yun himself, standing in our kitchen in the same charcoal suit he'd worn the morning of our wedding anniversary, holding a manila folder like it weighed nothing at all. He didn't sit down. He didn't touch me. He set the folder on the counter between us like it was a business transaction, and told me, in a voice I had never once heard him use with me, that our marriage was over, that the paperwork had already been filed, that I had 30 minutes to gather what I needed before a car took me to my new address. I laughed. I actually laughed, because for half a second I thought it was some kind of horrifying joke. Then I saw his face, and I understood he meant every word. I want you to imagine the specific kind of pain that comes from being discarded by someone who spent 2 years teaching you that you were finally safe. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I stood in that kitchen with my hand shaking so hard the folder slid off the counter and scattered across the floor, and I asked him one question. Why? He looked at me the way he looked at his enemies, flat, closed, unreachable, and said only, "This is what's best for you." Then he walked out of the kitchen, out of the penthouse, out of the only life I'd built in 3 years, and didn't look back once. The next morning, Tobias drove me to the Franklin County Courthouse, where a private mediator waited beneath the columns with a leather folder stamped Dissolution of Marriage. I did not understand that I was signing an acknowledgement and mediated separation packet, not a final decree filed with family court. I only understood the cameras gathering at the curb, Tobias gripping my elbow when my knees threatened to give way, and Do-yun standing 11 feet away with his jaw locked so tightly I could see the muscle jump from where I stood. He did not look at me while I signed. To everyone watching, the marriage ended on those marble steps. That was exactly what the performance had been designed to make them believe. By Wednesday, it was in the papers. Not the local papers, the ones that cover organized crime, the way other outlets cover celebrity gossip. Waitress, bride, OFCHOI, S1 decay, cheer, discarded after, 3H rears. They ran the photo of me from the diner, the same one that had been mailed to me weeks earlier, like it had been sitting in someone's file the whole time, waiting for the right moment to be useful. The comment sections called me a gold digger who'd finally been figured out. They called me disposable. They called me exactly what Do-yun's silence had made me feel like, standing in that kitchen, a woman who was never really wanted, only borrowed for a while. If you've ever been publicly humiliated by someone you trusted with everything and had to hold your head up anyway, because the whole world was watching to see if you'd fall apart, tell me the city you're watching from right now, because I need you to know, wherever you are, that woman in that kitchen was not finished. Not even close. The car took me to a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town, already furnished, already stocked with groceries, rent already paid a full year in advance under a name that wasn't mine. It was the strangest kind of exile, comfortable, quiet, and utterly humiliating. Every account with the Choi name attached to it was frozen or closed within 48 hours. Every friend I'd made through Do-yun's world stopped answering my calls, not out of cruelty, I'd learn later, but out of fear. I called Denise, the only friend I had left from my old life at the diner, the woman who used to cover my shifts when I couldn't afford childcare for my little cousin, back before any of this began. She let me cry into the phone for 40 minutes without saying a single word, and when I was finally done, she said the thing nobody else had the courage to say. "Sable, baby, you built a whole life waiting on people who could afford it. Maybe it's time you waited on yourself for a while. It wasn't kind, exactly, but it was true, and it was exactly what I needed to hear." I went back to work. Not at the same diner. I couldn't stomach the idea of being recognized, of customers whispering behind menus about the discarded Mafia wife slinging coffee again, but at a smaller place, 2 towns over, under my maiden name, where nobody knew Sable Winslow used to be Sable Choi. I picked the apron back up like it had never left my hands. I learned, again, how to read a room for the person about to stiff the check, how to carry 6 plates on one arm, how to smile through humiliation because the rent still needed paying. 3 years of silk and marble hadn't erased the woman who knew how to survive on tips and thick skin. And some nights, standing in that cramped kitchen taking food orders, I almost hated how easily I slid back into her skin. Almost. What I didn't know what I wouldn't learn for nearly 4 weeks was that every single night, a black sedan parked across the street from that new diner, engine running, headlights off, watching until my shift ended and I made it safely to my apartment door. I thought it was a stalker. I thought it was the same person who'd mailed that photograph. I never once suspected it might be the man who claimed he no longer wanted me at all. I ran into Priscilla Hartwell at the grocery store during the 3rd week of my exile, a woman I'd met exactly twice at Choi family functions, both times air-kissing my cheek and calling my dress brave, in a way that made it clear she meant something else entirely. She found me in the cereal aisle, wearing my work apron because I hadn't had time to change after my shift, and she looked at that apron the way people look at something they consider beneath them. "I heard you're back to waiting tables," she said, not bothering to hide the delight in her voice. It must be such a relief, honestly, going back to something so much more your speed. Some women just aren't built for that world, no matter how good the tailoring is. I could have shrunk. God knows 3 years earlier, before a diner booth and a quiet man with a coffee cup taught me I didn't have to make myself smaller for anyone. I would have shrunk exactly the way she wanted me to. Instead, I looked her dead in the eye. The same steady look I used to give truckers who tried to talk down to me over a $2 tip, and said, "I've been reading rooms full of people who think they're smarter than me since I was 19 years old, Priscilla. This apron taught me more about surviving your world than anything I ever learned wearing your kind of dresses. So no, it's not a relief. It's just a reminder of exactly how much I already knew before any of you decided I mattered." She didn't have a response for that. People like Priscilla rarely do, once you stop giving them the reaction they came looking for. I thought about that exchange for days afterward. Not because it hurt, it didn't. Not really. Not the way the tabloid headlines had, but because it was the first moment since the courthouse steps that I understood something true about myself. The apron had never been the thing that made me small. It was other people's willingness to decide, on my behalf, what it meant about my worth. I'd spent 3 years married to a man who never once made that mistake. Not until fear made him forget it during those terrible weeks. And I intended to remind him exactly who he'd married the moment I got the chance. The first real clue came from Grace. Grace Adiemi had been the Choi penthouse housekeeper since before Do-yun and I ever married. A quiet, sharp-eyed woman who'd never said more than 50 words to me in 3 years. Mostly because she didn't need to. She managed that entire household with a kind of silent precision that made conversation unnecessary. She found me outside the new diner on a Thursday night, standing beside a car I didn't recognize, holding a small paper bag. "You dropped this at the old apartment before you moved out," she said, holding out the bag. Inside was my old diner name tag from the original restaurant. The one that said Sable in cheap gold letters, the one I'd kept in a drawer for 3 years as a private reminder of who I used to be before silk and marble made me forget. I hadn't seen it in months. I certainly hadn't left it anywhere for Grace to find. "Why are you really here, Grace?" I asked. She glanced over her shoulder, the way people do when they're checking for cameras, or worse. "Mr. Choi didn't file anything with the family court downtown," she said quietly. "He filed with a private mediator 2 counties over who owes him a debt he'll never call in. There's a difference between a divorce that's final and a divorce that's meant to be seen." She pressed the name tag into my hand like it meant something more than sentiment. He kept this because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Ask yourself why a man discarding his wife would care about a 50-cent name tag. She left before I could ask another question. And for 3 days I turned that sentence over and over in my mind, unable to decide if it was hope or another cruelty dressed up as kindness. I found the second clue myself, 4 nights later, when the black sedan that had been following me finally made a mistake. It idled too long outside my apartment, engine running, and for the first time, I didn't run inside. I walked straight toward it, ripped the driver's door open before the man behind the wheel could stop me, and found myself staring at Tobias, one of Do-yun's longest-serving drivers, a man who used to bring me lemon water every morning without being asked. "Does he know you're here?" I demanded. Tobias wouldn't meet my eyes. Mrs. Choi, I was told to make sure nothing happens to you. That's all I can say. That's not all you can say. That's all you're allowed to say. There's a difference, and I am done being the only person in this story who doesn't get to know the truth. Something in my voice must have cracked whatever loyalty was holding him together, because Tobias finally looked at me, and what I saw in his face wasn't guilt. It was grief, the same grief I'd seen on Do-yun's face in the weeks before the divorce, the look of a man forced to hurt someone to keep them alive. He didn't divorce you because he stopped loving you, Tobias said, so quietly I almost missed it. He divorced you because someone inside his own house made him choose between losing you on paper or losing you for real. I stood on that sidewalk in the cold, my whole understanding of the previous 5 weeks collapsing and rebuilding itself in the space of a single sentence. Someone inside his own house. Not the Silver Crane, the rival syndicate the papers had blamed for weeks. Someone Do-yun trusted enough to let close to me. If you've ever had the ground shift beneath everything you thought you understood about the people closest to you, drop one word in the comments right now that describes exactly how that feels, because I promise you, betrayal doesn't even come close to covering it. It took me 11 more days to piece together what Tobias couldn't say out loud. I spent those days comparing names I remembered from Do-yun's study, dates from the tabloid leaks, and fragments Grace and Tobias had risked giving me. I only managed it because I finally did what I should have done from the beginning. I stopped waiting to be told the truth and started reading the room the way I'd been trained my whole life. I remembered the name on the shipping manifests Do-yun used to leave open on his study desk before all of this began, back when he trusted the walls of our home enough to work there instead of his office downtown. Han Jae-wook, Do-yun's most senior advisor, a man who'd been at his side since before I ever poured him his first cup of coffee. A man Do-yun called Uncle, even though there was no blood between them. A man who'd stood at our wedding and toasted to our happiness with tears actually visible in his eyes. Han Jae-wook had been quietly moving money for 18 months, skimming percentages off every shipment that came through 3 of the Choi family's smaller ports, funneling it into shell accounts under names that traced back, eventually, to a private island holding company that Han Jae-wook himself controlled. And when the numbers started drawing too much attention from the family's outside auditors, he needed a distraction large enough to occupy every set of eyes in the organization at once. He needed a war. So he leaked information to the Silver Crane, suggesting Do-yun was weak, distracted, vulnerable through the one thing he actually loved: his wife. He orchestrated the photograph. He orchestrated the highway accident. And when Do-yun figured out the threat was real and traced it back close enough to smell betrayal in his own house, Han Jae-wook made his final move. He convinced Do-yun that the only way to protect me long enough to find proof was to remove me from the board entirely, to make me a nobody the Silver Crane had no reason to touch, while Han Jae-wook quietly worked to make sure that proof never surfaced. Do-yun hadn't left me. He'd hidden me, in the one way his enemies would actually believe, while trying to expose a man he'd trusted for 20 years. And Han Jae-wook, thinking me removed from the game entirely, thinking me broken and gone, had gotten sloppy enough that a woman with nothing left to lose could finally see the whole board clearly for the first time. I should have gone straight to Do-yun with what I knew. I understand that now. But 3 years of marriage to a man who kept me shielded from every hard truth had taught me that the truth, delivered secondhand, always arrives too late to matter. So instead, I did the one thing nobody in that world expected a discarded waitress to do. I went straight to the source. The Choi family held its quarterly syndicate summit at the Regency Hall downtown every spring, a gathering of every allied family, every silent partner, every powerful man whose loyalty Han Jae-wook needed intact to keep his theft hidden a while longer. I knew the building because I'd catered a charity gala there once, years before Do-yun ever walked into my diner, back when I was invisible enough to move through rooms like these unnoticed. I still remembered the service corridors. I still remembered which doors the kitchen staff used, which uniforms nobody looked at twice. I borrowed a caterer's uniform from Denise's cousin, who worked events downtown, and I walked into the Regency Hall through the kitchen entrance an hour before the summit began, carrying a tray of champagne glasses like I'd done 1,000 times in another life. Nobody looks twice at the woman refilling glasses. Nobody ever has. It's the exact reason I survived years of rooms exactly like this one long before I ever wore a wedding ring. I found Han Jae-wook's private study on the 2nd floor. exactly where Tobias had once mentioned. Do-yun kept overflow files during large events, and inside a locked cabinet disguised as decorative paneling, I found 18 months of shipping manifests with numbers that didn't match the official ledgers downstairs, printed and hidden the way a man hides evidence he isn't ready to destroy, but can't risk carrying on him. I photographed every page with a phone Grace had smuggled to me 2 nights earlier, the same woman who'd handed me my old name tag and told me, without saying it outright, to trust the part of myself that used to survive by watching everyone else's hands instead of my own. I set the phone to forward each photograph the instant I took it, straight to Do-yun's private line, a trick I'd learned catering 100 events for people who thought a waitress was too simple to understand technology, too invisible to be dangerous. I was 3 photographs away from finished when the study door opened and Han Jae-wook walked in. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at me standing in his private study in a caterer's uniform, holding a phone full of his own theft, and smiled the way men like him always smile right before they decide whether to hurt you or buy your silence. "You should have stayed gone, Mrs. Choi," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "It would have been so much kinder." I did the only thing that had ever kept me alive in rooms with men who believed they held all the power I made myself smaller than I was, and let him believe he'd already won. "I'm just here for the champagne," I said, keeping my voice thin and frightened, letting my hands shake exactly as much as a truly terrified woman's hands would shake, no more, no less. I'd spent years learning exactly how much fear to show a man to make him feel safe enough to gloat instead of act. Han Jae-wook wanted, more than anything, to be the smartest man in the story. So I gave him the story he wanted. "You always were a clever girl," he said, stepping closer. Close enough that I could smell expensive cologne over something colder underneath it. Do-yun mistook cleverness for love, a common mistake powerful men make with women who know how to make themselves useful. He reached for the phone in my hand, unhurried, certain of his own victory. "Give me the phone, and I'll make sure your exile stays comfortable. Fight me, and I promise you, no one will ever find the parts of you worth burying." "The paper crane was you," I said, because I needed to know for certain before I lost the phone, before I lost the only proof that might matter. "Not the silver crane at all. You needed him afraid enough of an old enemy that he'd never think to look for a new one standing right next to him at dinner every night." Something flickered behind his eyes, not fear, not yet, but the particular satisfaction of a man being recognized by someone he'd assumed was too small to see him clearly. "You really did learn to read a room," he said, almost admiringly, the way a man compliments a dog for a trick he never expected it to master. "It's a shame Do-yun never let you sit at his table sooner. You might have caught me a year earlier and saved us all this trouble." I let him take 1 step closer before I did the thing 3 years of marriage and a lifetime of reading rooms had taught me to do at exactly the right moment I dropped the champagne tray. 8 crystal glasses shattered against the marble floor in an explosion of noise loud enough to be heard through the walls of a private study built for men who valued silence above all else, loud enough to draw exactly the kind of attention Han Jae-wook had spent 18 months avoiding. He lunged for the phone in the half-second of chaos, and I let him grab my wrist hard enough to bruise, because a bruised wrist was a small price to pay for the 90 seconds I'd just bought. The photographs had already sent. The study door burst open, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I looked up and saw Do-yun Choi's face without a single wall behind his eyes. He didn't look at Han Jae-wook first. He looked at me, at the bruise already blooming on my wrist, at the shattered glass at my feet, and something in his expression detonated. He crossed that room in 3 strides and put himself between Han Jae-wook and me, so completely I could no longer see the older man's face at all, only Do-yun's back, rigid and shaking with a rage I had never once seen him direct at anyone in my presence before. "You put your hands on my wife," Do-yun said, and his voice was so quiet, so controlled, that it frightened me more than shouting ever could have. "After everything I sacrificed to keep her alive, you put your hands on my wife." What happened next didn't unfold the way it does in the stories people tell about men like Do-yun Choi, settling scores, no gunfire, no bodies, no midnight docks. Han Jae-wook's downfall happened in front of 40 of the most powerful men on the East Coast, under chandeliers worth more than the diner I used to work in. And it happened because a woman he'd spent 18 months underestimating had spent her entire life learning exactly how to read a room full of people who thought she didn't matter. Do-yun walked Han Jae-wook out of that study and into the center of the summit floor himself, one hand still wrapped protectively around my bruised wrist, the other holding my phone with 18 months of stolen shipping manifests glowing on the screen. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every man in that room went silent the moment they saw Do-yun Choi's face, and silence, I was learning, was the loudest sound in his world. For 18 months, Do-yun said, turning the phone so the nearest allied family heads could see the numbers for themselves. Han Jae-wook has been stealing from every family in this room, not just mine. He funneled percentages off, shared shipments into an island account under his own name, and when auditors got close enough to notice, he needed a war loud enough to make sure nobody looked at his books instead. So he manufactured one. He leaked my wife's photograph to provoke the silver crane. He arranged the accident that nearly killed her on a public highway. And when I finally understood there was a traitor inside my own house, he convinced me the only way to protect her was to make the entire world believe I'd thrown her away. He looked at me then, in front of every man in that room, and said the thing I'd waited 6 weeks to hear. I did not divorce my wife. I hid her from a man I trusted enough to let him convince me it was the only way to keep her breathing. That mistake is mine, and I will spend the rest of my life correcting it. But the theft, the manipulation, the manufactured war that belongs entirely to Han Jae-wook, and I will not spend one more night sharing a table with the man who nearly cost me the only thing I have ever actually been afraid to lose. The allied family heads didn't need convincing beyond the numbers already glowing on the screen in my hand. Within an hour, every family represented in that room had frozen its dealings with Han Jae-wook, cutting him out of every shared account, every shipping route, and every ounce of standing he'd spent 20 years building. He was escorted from the Regency Hall by men who had once waited for his approval before speaking. By midnight, every door in his world had closed at once. In Do-yun's world, betrayal did not need blood to become permanent. Sometimes all it required was silence from everyone whose respect had once made you powerful. I stood beneath those chandeliers in a stolen caterer's uniform, my wrist bruised and my hands finally steady, and understood that the girl who used to read truckers and exhausted college students for spare change had just read the most dangerous room of her life and won. Do-yun found me an hour later on the Regency Hall's private terrace, staring at a skyline I used to see from the wrong side of a bus window. He reached into his jacket and placed a black velvet pouch in my palm. Inside was my wedding ring. "I never filed with the family court," he said. "The papers you signed were part of a mediated separation staged for the cameras. Our marriage was never legally dissolved. It only had to look final long enough for Han Jae-wook to believe you were no longer useful against me. You could have told me." My voice did not rise, but it did not soften either. I read headlines calling me disposable. I went back to waiting tables under another name because I could not bear people recognizing the woman you threw away. You made me question every good year we had together. "Do you understand what that cost me?" "Every night," he said, and the composure the rest of the world feared finally broke. "I sat outside that diner with the headlights off and watched you carry 6 plates on one arm like the last 3 years had never happened. I told myself I was protecting you. Some nights, I knew it was cruelty wearing protection's face, and I hated myself for asking you to survive the damage I chose for you." I closed my fingers around the pouch, but I did not give him my hand. "Being afraid to lose me did not give you the right to make me disappear," I said. "And the fact that I am still your wife on paper does not give you a shortcut back into my life. I love you, Do-yun. But love is not permission to erase my voice. I am not returning to the penthouse tonight, and I am not putting this ring back on because the threat is over." He went completely still. "Before I come home, we decide together what protection means," I continued. "No secret plans involving my life. No lies designed to save me. No man, not you, not Han Jae-wook, not anyone seated at your table gets to decide my future while I am kept outside the room. If danger concerns me, I hear the truth. If a decision changes my life, I help make it. If you cannot live with that, then whatever remains between us is not a marriage worth saving." "I can live with it," he said immediately. Then, more quietly, "I should have lived by it from the beginning. Words are not enough anymore. Then I will prove it without asking you to trust me before I earn the right. He looked at the pouch in my hand, then back at me. On paper, in every courthouse that matters, you were always my wife. But I understand now that being your husband requires more than keeping a legal promise hidden from the world. Then learn to treat me like your partner, I said. I will. I left the terrace with the ring in my pocket, not on my hand. Do-yun did not stop me. For the first time since this began, he let the next step belong entirely to me. 2 weeks later, the same outlets that had called me a discarded waitress ran the diner photograph again beneath a different headline. Waitress bride, exposes, embezzlement, etchim, saves CHOI, network from, internal collapse. I did not read every comment this time. I no longer needed strangers to revise their opinion of me before I could revise my opinion of myself. The uniform in that photograph had never made me powerless. It had trained me to notice everything powerful people assumed I was too small to understand. For the next 3 weeks, I kept my apartment. Do-yun did not send gifts, flowers, or men to pressure me home. He sent the truth. Every security report that mentioned my name arrived unedited. Every threat assessment included the evidence behind it. When he wanted to see me, he asked. When I said no, he accepted it. When I asked questions, he answered them without deciding which facts would be easier for me to carry. 3 weeks after the summit, he invited me to a meeting of the family's remaining senior advisors. Invited, not ordered, not announced on my behalf. I accepted because I wanted to see whether the promise he had made on that terrace would survive a room full of men accustomed to making decisions for everyone else. A chair waited at his right hand when I entered, but I remained standing until the room went quiet. For 18 months, Do-yun told them, a man I trusted stole from every person at this table while we looked in the wrong direction. Sable found what we missed. She has agreed to oversee personnel review and loyalty assessment across our shared operations. She will have access to every record required to do that work, and no information affecting her safety or authority will be withheld from her. I placed both hands on the back of the chair. This is not a ceremonial position, I said. I answer to evidence, not family pride. If I find something, I speak. If anyone in this room hides danger that concerns me, I walk away from this table and from every agreement attached to it. Those are my terms. Nobody objected. Only then did I sit. Do-yun kept his promise after that meeting. He did not confuse partnership with permission, and he did not treat one public apology as payment for 6 weeks of damage. Trust returned in ordinary pieces. A report placed in front of me before a decision. A question asked instead of an order given. A difficult truth spoken while there was still time for me to choose what to do with it. I kept the key to my apartment even after I began spending nights at the penthouse again. Do-yun never asked me to surrender it. He understood that coming home meant more when I remained free to leave. 3 months after the summit, we returned to the rooftop where he had first proposed. There was no press and no counsel. Only Grace, Denise, and Tobias, the 3 people who had chosen truth when silence would have been easier. Do-yun held the ring but did not reach for my hand. May I? He asked. That question mattered more than every promise he had made, while believing love gave him the right to choose for me. I held out my hand. Now you may! He slid the ring back onto my finger. You were always my wife, he said, his voice unsteady. But from this day forward, I will never forget that you are also your own woman. I do not stand in front of you. I stand beside you. I looked at the skyline, the highway, and the city that had watched me move from a diner counter to a penthouse, and then tried to decide which version of me mattered more. They had all been the same woman. The waitress. The wife. The woman in the caterer's uniform. The woman at the council table. None of those lives had replaced the others. Each one had taught the next how to survive. I still keep my old name tag in the drawer beside the black velvet pouch. Sable, in cheap gold letters, faded around the edges. Some nights I hold it for a minute, not because I need reminding of who I used to be, but because I finally understand she never left. She just learned that the biggest rooms are often the easiest ones to read, because powerful people become careless when they believe the woman serving them cannot see what they are trying to hide. If this story reminded you that being underestimated can become the most dangerous advantage in a room full of people who think they already know your worth, hit subscribe. Tell me which moment stayed with you most: the courthouse steps, the shattered champagne glasses, or the moment Sable refused to put the ring back on until trust had been earned. And if you believe love should protect your life without taking away your voice, leave the word partner in the comments. I'll see you in the next story.